everybody. There's one seat here.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming and joining us this evening. I have the great pleasure of introducing Indian architect Anupama Kundu as the inaugural speaker of our Spring 2018 lecture series. Just to give you a few brief introductory notes, Anupama was born in Pune, India. She graduated from the Sir J.J. College of
How kind not to reveal my age.
University of Mumbai in 1989 and received her PhD degree from the TU Berlin in 2008. Anupama Kundu's internationally recognized and award-winning architecture practice started in 1990, some 28 years ago, and demonstrates a strong focus on material research and experimentation towards an architecture that has a low environmental impact and is appropriate in its own socio-economic context. She has built extensively in India and has had the experience of working, researching, and teaching in a variety of cultural contexts all around the world. It includes the TU Berlin, the AA School of Architecture in London, the Parsons New School of Design in New York, University of Queensland, Brisbane, IUAV in Venice, UTSAB in Barcelona, Cornell University, I'm almost done, UCSC, and IU University in Madrid, where you are currently a professor there. Kundu's work extends to urban design and planning projects, with her background in rapid urbanization-related development issues, about which she has written extensively. Her book chapter, Rethinking Affordability in Economic and Environmental Terms, is published in the book Inclusive Urbanization, Rethinking Policy, Practice, and Research in the Age of Climate Change, published in 2015. She is also the author of Roger Anger, Research on Beauty, Recherche sur la beauté, Architecture from 1958 to 2008, published in Berlin in 2009. Roger Anger, some of you might have heard of this gentleman. He was a French architect in charge of designing Auroville, which is a futuristic experiment in design and planning for a community without nations, and has become a multicultural paradise that has metamorphed into an ecological Shangri-La. Her research-oriented practice was exhibited twice at the Venice Architecture Biennale, with the installation Field the Ground Wall House 1-to-1 in 2012, and more recently, Building Knowledge, an inventory of strategies in 2016. Kundu is currently working on a solo show at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark, scheduled for opening in 2020. Tonight, she has titled her lecture, Building Knowledge, Building Community. Please help me welcome Anupama Kundu.
Okay. We have a place here. Thank you. Thanks for the long introduction. And yeah, nice to see all of you here. Great to be here and see how warm it is. People in winter with t-shirts and all that. Very nice place to study. So yeah, I thought of sharing with you my the whole body of my work through a kind of a path that I took to explain this when I exhibited my work in the recent Venice Biennale, where I called it Building Knowledge, you know, in the context of 25 years of my practice and so on. So I tried to summarize that, and I decided to walk you through a similar structure. And I want to just say, before I start with showing you my context and how the kind of architecture I do took, you know, what kind of concerns I became preoccupied with and how it reflected back in my design. I want to just say a word about that when I graduated 28 years ago, already all these problems that we see here about rapid urbanization related issues all over the world actually, including so many social, economic and environmental imbalances. Everywhere, almost every project creates more problems than it solves. If one sees all those underlying impact, all the various things that unconsciously it impacts. So I started in the beginning when I graduated, all those things were known. Now everything looks a lot bigger, but those problems haven't gone away. I just realized at that time that we need to find other ways of building in order not to cause the same problems, or at least we need to reflect much more about the impact of our micro decisions. We think one person doing this and that, but everyone's doing those micro decisions, and it's adding up to an environment that's increasingly unlivable and so on. So when I got the idea for this title, Building Knowledge, I felt I was seeking a knowledge about building differently, and I knew that there was no shortcut to knowledge. While everything is changing so rapidly, the quest for knowledge is going to just take as long as it takes to build the knowledge, and I was seeking it anyway. But later when I got into academia, I realized that the building of the knowledge is almost the more important thing, and to look at building as a verb rather than the building itself, because you see all the buildings we're doing, like even we see in Austin now, whatever I've seen since I got here, you realize that just the mere building of buildings doesn't build, like houses are built, and so if you stack so many of them, you're not going to have housing, or you're not going to create a city by just repeating all those components many times. So I think the building of knowledge, and later I added the building of community, is a need of the hour everywhere. Wherever I go, I see more and more that, and there's actually a structure to it, and that if one really looks at what our processes are rather than the product, then there is really a difference we can make, I think, and you can keep on increasing that community and the knowledge and so on. And I think every architectural project for me now, since quite a while, it's an opportunity to build knowledge and to build community. So in that spirit, I'm going to show you and walk you through some of my work. Before I just want to explain, I come from Bombay. It's very crowded, and it's much more crowded than when the picture was taken and when I used to go there to study. You wonder where all those new people fit who were born since the time I graduated. But I want to just mention with one slide each some of the key issues that I feel I'm tackling ever since I graduated, or I try to tackle and address. Population, and in India this is a big one, because we are 1/6 of the global population, but we occupy only 2.4% of the world's land. So we are, while on one hand, a lot of people don't have access to the basic resources, on the other hand, the cities are unable to deliver whatever infrastructural needs there are. So there's huge gaps between what the demand is and what we could realistically supply. On top of it, we have other layers of globalization, etc. But in any case, the per capita resource consumption that is permissible for India, just by the sheer number of people in every household, is very different, and already therefore we can't afford to take examples from other places. Already this is a very, very big difference. The second concern is migration, the rural-urban migration. The fact that even though we see all those crowded pictures, the bulk of India is still an agricultural land and an agricultural society with the rural mindset. So mere moving into an apartment building is not going to change they won't become urban, it just doesn't happen. So all those identity issues, all these complexities, because all these are rural areas about to be urban, and in the condition in that kind of context, obviously bylaws are not yet written. Development is going to happen because somebody needed to pave a road in order to get a truck to get in to deliver bricks and so on. And then that's going to become the highway of the future or whatever. Things are done ad hoc. And then there's this whole problem of, complex psychological aspect of migration. These are issues that I took up in India in my immediate context, but all of these are relevant all the more everywhere since then. I see whether people are migrating because of war, because of job opportunities, whatever it is. There are an increasing number of people who have been uprooted and have to be airdropped into other contexts. And then the problem of globalization and that kind of aspirations, that, if you go to Gurgaon, which is about 30 kilometers outside Delhi, and you'll see all these multiplex kind of, if you just photograph the top of buildings, it could be Dubai, Singapore, which would be bad enough. I mean, it could be any city almost looks like that nowadays. But if you look at the ground, you'll realize immediately how rural it is. And this is not the only image where you have this pig and a cow and chicken and whatnot. You have also those kind of shops with a tea stall and where you can buy loose cigarettes to smoke and all of that. Because obviously those malls are not going to supply that. They'll supply some international brand. They'll probably be Starbucks. So the Indian now wants his Starbucks as well as the local chai. So all of those informal things are, inbuilt into this. But what is also worrying here about this globalization-driven development is the fact that the consumption pattern which was already hard to meet in the first place, is now completely different, because everything has to be centrally air conditioned, when even one room was probably not air conditioned. We're making this jump. So what it really does is it not only creates aspirations, people feel that development means this, and the politicians and so on, they have all these kind of posters, and they don't realize that Gurgaon is still struggling to provide electricity. There are generators, all these multiplexes are not able, there's not enough water, all the basic problems have not been addressed. And the social gap, the social segregation, which is a very key concern in all my work, is that what we're actually manifesting in this world is actually increasingly a gap. The urban form of every city, and I found that even in cities like Madrid, where the periphery and the quality of what is being built now compared to what the city, the facilities that, or the quality of life we used to have, is degrading everywhere because of affordability issues and social segregation. And in the Bombay I left had as many, the slums were always present beside apartments as long as I remember, but the gap wasn't this wide and this big. It's now, it's like always that the urban form is recognized by two cities coexisting, each one living in their zone. These guys are going to shop in the market, there's going to be a market for them, there's going to be a mall for those other guys, and they never go into the other person's city. And the kind of the formal housing that many cities, whether it's New York or London or wherever in the world it is, the way we've structured the management of housing that comes through this developer-driven thing makes it impossible for the common person with a job to actually pay the rent for or buy. So for most people, housing was a thing that if you ask children what is a house for, they'll say it's for living. But for all the adults, they'll say it's an investment. And the whole way of thinking about housing, like when I was saying earlier in that interview that, the birds and the bees, they built their house and they get on with their lives. They just spend a small proportion of their life building the house, and I think humans did the same. But today, when you're just about to die, if you're lucky, you'll have paid your house and it's finally yours. So you don't have the house to live in, you're living only to be able to pay that house, which is not even nice. It's like the whole life got wasted in trying to pay the bills, So, so this is something that concerns me, and I want to talk about the tyranny of housing, of achieving housing, and nobody is discussing how serious it is, like even in the Indian cities, that it's impossible for the bulk of the people to achieve a house in the society, the way we've created it. And we can't not manifest the social gap. The final issue that I want to raise as a concern is the materiality of architecture itself. And that is another very complex area with the industry, the post-industrial building systems and large companies who are now offering us some standard things in their catalogs, the architect's role becoming more and more passive, and and then we are living in environments that we help enable that construction of it, but we know from the beginning is not going to be nice, and it'll be worse than it was before. And one of the reasons that I began researching materials was because I realized how many imbalances the choice of materials create. The fact that concrete, RCC, reinforced cement concrete, has become a vernacular material. Even every common park bench is being done in it, in a country where we don't have enough steel and cement to go around, even for the main bridges and so on, because they are highly energy intensive materials, and that we need, it's a scientific thing. You can't do it like mud construction without knowledge. If the mud dries up, you add some water, and that's what they're doing to the cement, because they're handling these materials in a very vernacular way. So a lot of when concrete is badly made, it's a big liability, and so all these buildings, in a couple of years, they are leaking all over, and it's a big problem. Anyway, what is interesting is all the diversity of, languages, food, and clothes, and whatever we have in India. Every couple of kilometers, it's another palette you have of things. Same we had with the building construction, whether it was about building skills or materials. We have we've had a very diverse way of building. And all of that is replaced by this, and it's very sad. You see all the buildings that you see are badly made concrete with brick that is not allowed to be load bearing. And that is a problem I discovered in Australia, in America, everywhere. One thinks about how Louis Kahn would have responded if a brick is not even allowed to be load bearing anymore. And people say, oh no, that's too complicated if you're going to make it load bearing. So there's this fear to build in any other way than this steel glass thing or the RCC thing. And so, and despite of all the problems that it creates and the homogeneity, and therefore immediately going for a high-tech way of building, you immediately exclude all the local people, first of all, in those places. That's another huge problem. So all these complex things I've mentioned now, many things here, all of this used to worry me since I graduated. So I decided when I began my construction, so I'm going to tell you why I put a lot of attention on the idea of building the knowledge, because I realized that the reason why we don't do a lot of things is because we just don't know how to do it. People don't admit, but many engineers used to tell me then, oh no, this is too complicated. This cannot, a catenary volt is very difficult to calculate that. And I said, but all the people, masons used to know throughout, it was widespread knowledge. And I realized increasingly people actually don't know, and they cover up and justify and give you other reasons why you ought to be using it, some other standard thing that they know how to do. And I realized that it's worth, I realized that, because probably I was young and naive, I did not fear things I didn't know. I always felt that, many people feel that you have to know a thing, you have to learn. I'm learning piano. One day I'm going to perform, But actually when you're playing that piano while learning it, you're already playing the piano, So I think it's very important that if you don't start doing that, you'll never have the knowledge for it. And I realize that not knowing a thing is not a reason for not doing it, because there are other people in the world who do know whatever you don't know, or at least if you start doing that, which you feel ought to be done, that's the only way to develop the knowledge for it. So I realized it would be a slow process, which was not a problem, because in the beginning you don't have any jobs when you graduate. So you have the time, you must take the time to think about things, I feel, and it's not so bad when you're not that busy. It's very important how we spend our time, I think. And I just want to introduce that process because when Alejandro Aravena he asked all the architects to submit a sketch of what we were going to do in the Biennale before they allotted us spaces. I had sent in the sketch, and he had the theme of the year was it was a battle type topic, you know, what was it called? Reporting from the front. He said reporting from the front. So he felt people who are doing even small gestures by being in the front line of problems, he wanted to give it space. So I thought, you know, I thought the best thing to do is, because today is not a good time to talk about war and battles, you know, and I didn't want to really go that way. I wanted to say that I think the best ammunition is knowledge, actually, to be able to tackle, because the strategies are important, what you do in a battle also. I think if you know your first principles, if you really develop knowledge, then you would be able to have the means to respond to whatever changing situation, because you're rich inside and you know how to respond because you've cultured your mind and so on. So I wanted to say, instead of discussing always in magazines and everywhere when people write about our work, they talk about all those fruits, you know, all those projects that they talk about. But I felt it was interesting to talk about the roots, where actually that's what you do in your own private space, and when it has to do with what you read, what you think when you're not working also, and what kind of knowledge you're chasing. And I think the trunk of the tree is in fact the architectural process itself, which is about synthesizing all those different concerns. And I think architects actually are taught very well. It's the old school way that we know how to synthesize all kinds of concerns, because every project is a research, a new thing. And through that process of synthesizing, the fruits that come out of it is just natural. And according to the conditions of, you know, the fruit will have its it's the consequence. And I wanted to talk about the underground part which others don't get to see. So the idea of building knowledge and this term and this lecture came out of that, you know, saying let's expose how we have been chasing all these diverse areas of knowledge. So now to just talk about the process of my work a little bit, so I'm going to talk about mostly processes, and in the end I'll just show some of the fruits. Okay, so I've all these bold letters that are going to appear are what I tried to analyze as my strategies that came out of the quest for knowledge. And the first response begins always for me with, of course, the place in which you're going to act, and to unearth the roots of that place itself. And so I actually follow two things, you know, two broad things. One is about what kind of life takes place, because for me architecture is, like we spoke earlier today, it's located in the void. It's not, even though there is this materiality preoccupation only because of its negative impact, actually architecture is about designing the void, because what we inhabit is the part we didn't build. And so the shaping of it is the key thing, I think, to the human being's well-being, according to the life and activity that the users need to you know, spend their lives in. So to understand what is best for the life to go on, what is really the space required is the key thing, but to also look at it in conjunction with the livelihood. That's another aspect of life, is the livelihood of the people, of the place, and to see all of this critically, but to not forget about it, is to just to see how, you know, the people who use the building, they use the void. The people who make the building, they will be concerned with the materiality, because according to which context, which topography, what materials happened, what skills that place generated over centuries, you know, one can work with all of these as tools, and when one doesn't allow them to continue, to be aware what we are disrupting in the not using of some of those. So I started examining those kind of things. So from the beginning, you know, when I moved from Bombay to Auroville, and also before I moved through my travels, I started observing how materials are made and how the people of a place, how they are affected, I mean how natural it is, the production of the material. From all the materials actually, whether they are industrial, whether they are high energy or low, all materials come from the ground. Whether it's a tree and a live material or the earliest man-made material, the brick, or all the sophisticated materials, they come from the ground. The difference is some of them need energy and maybe huge amounts to produce it, and some processes, and some others can be used directly through skills or through machines and so on. So I started observing those systematically and looking at understanding the some mechanical actions, you know, that people do in their place, and they are, we call them unskilled labor in India. But if you just start observing, and if you have time to observe all of this, you realize that actually how closely connected those livelihoods are to a certain region, because when they, for instance, when they fire those bricks, the casuarina wood that you see has been planted by themselves at a season when they are not growing rice, for instance, and they'll create some other activity for themselves, and then the thinnings of those forests will be used for firing bricks. When the thing has to be thinned further with bigger diameter wood, then they would use it for scaffolding, for example, and so on. So, you know, there's all of this interdependency, and it became intriguing to see that when you understand those linkages, you realize if you just prescribe an industrial brick in this area, what the implications are. For example, not only in terms of the amount of coal you're going to use, but everything, and the people who are going to work there, how these people are doing it as a natural part of their farming cycle and so on. So I realized without clear answers that there are all of these complex things happening in the territory, which I started discovering by going around on my motorbike in that area, you know, coming from Bombay and having the time to observe and realizing, you know, these kind of people who are, whether they make lime or generations of people, like now, for example, this generation of people who only do this all day, if architects come and prescribe Portland cement, because that is what appeared in our curriculum and we just didn't think, we did it unconsciously sometimes, we don't realize what, at least for till the next generation, you know, the small micro decisions we make. What I mean by micro decisions is that there are huge amounts of people who are being affected by those decisions, and not even questioning whether lime is better or cement, and I don't have a preference or a judgment, but it's just, it widens your mind to think about things that are already occurring, you know, or discovering these stone craftsmen who hand extract granite, and they can level them perfectly, because they used to sell grinding stones for masalas. Now everyone's got a mixer. Even if there's no power cut, they'll still wait for when if there's not enough reliable power, still these gadgets are available. People have their TVs and these machines to do everything. But these people don't have a future automatically, and here they're sitting with a skill without a future. On the other hand, we complain that people don't have the skills to build those buildings. So it's like putting the two together. So one of the strategies for me is to first of all critically determine what exists locally, even in terms of capacities and materials. And this is an image that shows, you know, that early time, you know, when you can see how lost and blank I am about this kind of. You see, it's not important not to know. I think it's very interesting almost, because that's when you are very curious and you start learning a lot. And you know what I was basically doing here, I was just arrived in this region, and I used to see these potters who used to try to sell their pots, you know, at the wayside, and you knew that no one's going to buy those cooking pots, and you knew that these guys are on their way out, kind of. And some people would think that immediately those objects should be put in the museum and all that. But I'm not a nostalgic person. I don't mind if people stop using terracotta pots. You know, I really don't mind at all. I don't think it's great to have, you know, things that don't break and so on. But what I'm worried about is that to lose that capacity of the potter, who took generations to develop this knowledge, and just for no reason, we are never going to know anymore how to do, like, you know, how to divert that knowledge and to go on. How can the potter go on and further his knowledge, you know? So I used to think about that, and I actually began by, you know, I mean, trying to do roofing systems out of terracotta, you know, because I realized there was a city to be built, and I thought everything could be a prototype for, you know, I was very kind of optimistic, assuming that everything, you know, could have, you know, there's a whole city to be built, we have to think of the materials. And so even though I just had one house to do, I used to always think in this grand scale. So it was not bad, because it made me actually understand what's going on the big picture as well. But it was about, first we produced these kind of elements, and you can see how different it is, you know, when it is on artisanal level, even though it was quite high quality, because we you know, there was a Californian potter, Raymaker, in the area who helped me up the quality. We designed these kind of you know, well-fired pots that could be done with just coconut shells and so on, but it could allow, you know, later you will see how it reflects in the architecture. But at the same time, looking at how, not looking at high tech or low tech separately because of the changing landscape, but started looking at how one could negotiate in every project and define the extent to which one is intending to be high tech or low tech, or what makes sense, how much to employ the machine, how much to employ people for each case to case. And I realized that these are all decisions that are going to actually shape the project, and they should be made before, almost as a strategy. And so I also realized that you know, a lot of these kind of systems, you find a lot of engineering kind of, I'm leaning a lot on engineering to produce things when I critically examine local skills and materials and so on. With the help of engineering knowledge, trying to minimize, you know, materials. So here we are testing some prototypes with masons to be able to build roofing systems that are self-supporting, insulating. You know, there's a lot of terracotta roofs you'll find all over in India, but usually they need a lot of wood support. So the wood is not there, so let's not throw the baby with the bathwater, and to, you know, reinvent some of those materials you're used to seeing in another way, and fill in the gaps by bringing in people of knowledge who will know how to do it, and to work with the people who have some skills. So similarly, I started, then eventually I had such a relationship with the potters in the area, and I realized that even the local pot that they were actually making for cooking and selling could be used to construct filler slabs that was inspired by what Laurie Baker was doing at that time. But I realized that if you increase the depth and use engineering to be able to save much more amounts of steel, like you could save in a distance of say 60 centimeters, you know, instead of having a bar every 10 or 15, you know, you could save like 2/3 of the steel immediately, for instance, and that's a big saving. On the other hand, you could also, because you have these kind of voids, you can actually create ceilings with mud plaster over, you know, all this kind of cheap formwork that they can afford. Formwork is another area I researched a lot, because that's one reason why people don't do efficient concrete systems, because the formwork becomes complicated and expensive. So I started here, you know, mud is used to level the thing so that you're casting concrete on a mud surface, and then you can just wash it off with a hose. So I started doing, you know, looking into, I also did some kind of jack arch systems where for flat roofs where you can't use the form to support the thing, you know, I tried to introduce some prefab beams at distances of 75 centimeters and so on. Then I also realized that in these times we have to allow for radical experimentation, not only experimentation and in general, because we are looking for new solutions and that are appropriate. I have done in all of these, you know, investigations, some of them have been very, very radical, and I think even if a technology has even 10% chance of succeeding, it ought to be tried, because I started feeling that when the known problems are already definitely wrong, then it's already a failure. So it's worth trying something where, because affordability in environmental terms, not only in economic terms, is so pressing that we just have to enable experimentation. So I have done things again in collaboration with Ray Meeker in the line of the terracotta work. In fact, my PhD was about this, is about baking houses in situ after constructing them. So that's what I mean by radical experimentation. See, what happens is, if you typically build, if you fire bricks, about 40% of the energy goes into the kiln wall, again and again, each firing. So Ray's idea, and he pioneered this technology, was to build the mud house in areas where the earth is conducive, and fill the space up with other ceramic products, like terracotta products, because there's hundreds of things you can do, from tiles to water spouts, and if you look around, wash basins, toilet pans, everything is ceramic almost. So there's a lot of things one could cook along with the house. So the house, for me, what was interesting was not only that this could be actually achieved to cook a house on the spot, which means you don't even need cement, because you're using mud mortar and your knowledge of firing large ceramic structures, and that is enabling that the kiln became the house eventually. But first of all, instead of the house being a consumer of building materials, it became a producer, because about 75% of things that are produced are in fact stacked inside this huge volume, and that also takes up the fuel cost. It would have taken it up anyway. Theoretically, the house is almost for free. It's just the labor, it's 100% labor, so all the money remains in the local economy. People in those areas already make bricks, they know how to do it, and so on. So these are some of the more radical experiments that I've been doing, and you'll see there are lots of students in all of these projects, because I also believe that things that are already known should be done in the practice, and things that we don't know, rather than teaching students what we know, I think I like to take students to the things where we don't know. We all try to find out. So then there's a sense of empowerment for the student, because while working on a unprecedented thing, automatically they will learn all about brick in a much deeper way, because otherwise you take a brick for granted. So this enables us to know everything about brick making and go beyond it. So here you see it's so complicated, because there has to be flue holes to let the oxygen in for combustion, and then you see all those, some fired bricks below and all the rest, and then finally the house cooks for 3 or 4 days, and then you know, in India you have all those bricks have the initials of the person who makes those bricks. So we have Ray and my name. We made a die for those bricks ourselves, but you can produce any size of bricks and whatever inside some of these houses. And in fact, that was a project with a zero budget. We had to produce homes for homeless children. So I tried to bring all these different things together. There is a project that really needs something, then there are students who want to go and do a workshop or something, and at the same time bring the experts in and try to take the technology further. Another strategy is participation. Nowadays it's being used a lot, but for me it's a very simple thing. I feel that if in housing it's very, very important that people should have the choice not to have huge bank loans, but offset their costs through their own work. And many people say that there is no time, you know, to build, because in urban areas people can't. You don't have to look upon a construction site in a typical way either. We have to design things that people can do in the weekends, or in, you know, it's not something so rare. Like in Berlin, they had done all the modernization through what they call Selbsthilfe projects, where if you helped yourself, then the government gave you a lot of money to be able, and that's how they managed to get a lot of housing fixed without taking huge amounts of loan, by relying on the people's time. And people always have time. Look how much time people spend on, whether it's Facebook, gyms, or whatever it is. You know, you have a new idea and people do have time to, and especially if it means that their bank loans would be much less, then we can. And we've done a lot of housing projects where some of the things, I mean, even whether it's painting a wall or whatever it is, some things should be thought from that point of view. So in this case, there were rammed earth walls made, you know, so that anybody could, there's labor, there's some amount of unskilled activities where almost anyone could be, you know, they don't have to do it, they have the choice to participate in order to reduce costs. And therefore, like it means a lot of extra work for the architects as well, because it's more complicated, but it's more affordable. And then when we talk about rethinking materials, we're also looking a lot at urban waste and trying to reuse some of these. For example, in Venice, in the Chipperfield Biennale, we tested the same idea of pots through using glass bottles, or we've done masonry with some of those, or sometimes just merely buying products not from the material manufacturers. If you buy a glass block, it's very expensive compared to a chai glass, you know. And so sometimes we've just done things when really, because when you work for some social projects where people don't have any money, they would either not have the whole housing solution, then you really are forced to think outside the box. And so, for example, you know, we've been often, you know, using all this, like the windows have that size because all the windows could be solved with $2, because from the junk market you could buy those bicycle wheels that could become the formwork and that could later be, you know, so one starts sometimes thinking in those directions. Another strategy is to have the opportunity for thinking with the hand, you know. Look, we have even looked at, it's sad to say, but books as a waste material. It really broke my heart to actually even decide to venture into that. But when I found out the amounts of books that are being pulped in Australia, or the books that have to be burnt in Barcelona, let's say, you know, because we are overproducing books, and it's a huge source of urban waste. I don't want to go off track here, but we had taken that up as a building material also. In fact, in the Barcelona project that I did, we did, because I was new to Spain and I saw this vacuum packed. I like to use technologies that are not so precious. You know, this vacuum packing is quite a household thing for all the jamon and all that kind of delicate, you know, olives and all that. So I thought it would be quite interesting, since it was an artistic installation, to like prolong the life of the book similarly as the food by just forcibly opening the book at least once before it dies, you know, just open it, open the book to the thing and vacuum pack it like that. And also because it's plastic, it then could be used to make, I made canopies out of that eventually. It was called Library of Lost Books. When we are going to go into the fruit sections, there's going to be a few images. So then for some, this is just to show you what I do with students, you know, where when some materiality investigation has to be done. In this case, you know, we had an exhibition in Museo Eco in Madrid, and I was doing the Barcelona thing, so I thought let's investigate books as a building material. The students had to actually, I told them they were looking at the changing landscape of what's going to happen to the library in the future cities where we are not going there to lend and borrow books anymore, etc. But whatever models they did, everything had to be made out of books. It was not an obsessive thing, it was also very practical. I was telling them, imagine this is a utopian country. We have come to this gallery and the only material they have is lots of old catalogs in the cellar. That's the only building material in this country. What can we do with it? So there are one-to-one exercises, models and everything. We use only that material. So in the end, they did a wall as well with all the technologies that they developed. It's of course, look, it's not serious. I'm not planning to go and build buildings out of books. The idea is when you can look at a book in a new way for 2-3 days, you'll go back and even look at a brick in a new way. It's just about looking at the thing in another way, like trying to just explore a new object, or in this case where we are exploring fabric, because you know I came across huge amounts of denim waste in India. It's a big source of pollution in Ahmedabad because all the rest of the world has to wear jeans that are made in India mostly, and so all the jeans go to those countries and all the rest of that fabric, literally the jeans negative shape of how the thing is, those are in India. So we are thinking what to do with all that, you know. And also fabric is a part of architecture that most people don't handle because again lack of knowledge. Tensile structures are very complicated and they are always, these complicated things are very high tech, and so it's important to allow students that kind of experience. So we've done a lot of research with how to, without putting in elasticity, I used smoking patterns from my own experiences earlier of stitching and all that, to be able to bring in an elasticity so that the fabric doesn't sag when it does those kind of forms, you know. So we were working with that. And then finally, academic collaboration is also one of the strategies, where this is what we did with the students of AA. You know, I mentioned this also earlier to some people, sorry for the repetition, but I try, when I do a design studio, I look upon academia as an opportunity to connect deeper with the real world, rather than look at it as a place where you just can be in a bubble and get even more theoretical, and then you feel, oh God, there's this big gap, how do I plug into the real world? I think that because the rest of the real world are not thinking about the future of their cities, I think only in academia we can afford to do it, and I feel the only way is if the students have we deepen their relationship with ground realities. So I insist usually on, even in a typical design studio like here, they were doing something in the Hook Park, and I felt that it's good for them to know roundwood structures, to demystify the work that Fry Auto had done on their campus, etc., about roundwood, because you know, roundwood allows you to build with a smaller section. I mean, a younger plant, like a 3-year-old tree, could give you the same cross section as a 25-year-old if you want a rectangle section. So if you harvest it earlier and use the whole circular cross section, you know, there's an efficiency there. So we, for instance, here we were building, we did a design build thing, but it's very much not only built in my workshop, you know, it's about designing with awareness of reality. So there are artisans and craftsmen there. I don't expect the students to reduce everything to their level of their capacity to build, etc. It's about remaining as an architect, but getting an exposure to 4 realities, you know, real scale, real place, real materials, and now I don't remember the 4th one. Real place, people, material, and real scale. Because I think every other designer, you know, like fashion designers, and they know how, they are confident in their scale, but architecture is hard. So sometimes we work with models and we don't realize that we think the cantilevers that we did in our models are going to stand in real scale, or we don't confront the weight and the texture and all of that. So I feel sometimes just a 1 week or a, you know, 10-day studio, sometimes just a 2-day workshop also allows you to have the learning from that. So these are things the students built. They had to build a watchtower in a botanical garden in 10 days. So they design, I bring craftsmen to support their knowledge. Like for instance, in this fabric workshop in Ahmedabad, there are craftsmen who do patchwork, artisans, the students are working with them. They are handling sewing machines brought in, you know, so that they can just enter the material and have other experts around them, interdisciplinary kind of inputs. Or in the case of these books, you know, we partnered with IAC. They do very robotic kind of digital architecture. It's a place for that. But even so, they do their prototypes increasingly by hand first, in order to test what kind of machines they have to design to 3D print, etc. So, you know, these are the kind of things that come out of those explorations. Or this in Mexico, where the Tetra Pak, you know, all these materials are not bought. Whatever we find out their properties and all that. In this case, we found that it's so complicated to recycle it properly, because aluminium, there's so many different plastic layers, it's very complex. It's a big problem in the world to recycle this. So most people are adding further chemicals and making boards and then using it. But I think that's even more complicated. So what we did was, we just realized it's such a fantastic material and waterproof and all that. So we filled it back with water or sand and just used it as a brick. But it was just a 2-day workshop. So we actually produced kind of a wall also to learn, you know, how to make this Eladio Dieste forms, and how do you do the form work for that? How do you survey and all that. So you learn a lot of simple things when you do some kind of, see like this, you see how are the guides. So here, this is for an event in Segovia where we are trying to distribute water, and so just stacking them somewhere. We use this opportunity with students to design that event, and by the end of it, you distribute the water and everything is finished. So these are some of the things I am doing in academic kind of collaboration. But in the engineering part, which I already actually mentioned, I'll just, where we are really, the crux of our research is in the way to engineer things so that the future could build the same number of square meters with significantly less material. So now I'm looking at ferrocement because it replaces big diameter bars and it allows you to use very, very thin elements with finely distributed mesh. So I've been looking at origami patterns, to be able to see how to generate folded forms and build full-scale prototypes and test them at a conceptual level. So form work, as I said, was a very complicated thing or expensive thing. So here, since the material is an inch thick, so it can be cast on recycled cartons. It can be packed like that. For disaster relief or something, you could just go and unfold this element. Even the mesh can come already creased, and then, this is just a prototype for a housing project we're developing. But this kind of thing can be built in 4 days, for example. So it's also very cheap. So the same ferrocement research is now also what we've recently developed is a modular system version of that, like a Lego block thing, where these masons can, in their backyards, in the evenings, etc., they can produce, for their own context, they can produce singular blocks, and whenever we need to assemble them, we collect them as the engineer who goes around, so it's not in a factory. So we go and we produce this kind of things, and we can assemble them again in 3 or 4 days. So it makes housing, I want to relieve people of the tyranny of taking a year, building a house, etc., and to build it affordably, but also flexibly, because a person can stack all of these belongings, and it can be, we've tested a couple of structures like that, or toilet blocks and other things in ferrocement. So this is my current research. And finally, I'm also trying to use installations and exhibitions that I've been doing as opportunities to build knowledge. That means to bring in engineers who you could not pay otherwise. So when you're doing a Venice Biennale, you can have them partnering, producing all this different fabrics, meshes, like if you want to test carbon fiber, glass fiber, and non-rusting elements, etc. We've done this with Mike Schleich. The Indian masons went to Berlin. They could produce those same elements, and then we could test them. So the people in Venice didn't get to see all that, but the budget was actually driven towards furthering knowledge on ferrocement, and we got all those elements tested because we would never find the budget for that otherwise. So, we built the Venice exhibition by looking at what the previous people have left behind as waste. So we literally, like vultures, we just, use those what we can see and find. But our students have gone with us before we did the installation to be able to understand what, after our exhibition, what could be the third life of the pavilion that we do. So they've been figuring out the homelessness situation, etc., and then we managed to allow through these installations the opportunity to learn about everything in a project, from design, concept, quantities, estimation, engineering, everything. And all this, working with engineers, craftsmen, all of that. And with this type of methods, including installations now, sometimes I found it's easier to do than research grants where you have no guarantee. You keep on hoping for, funds. It's quite nice to do what you could do without a research grant inside the exhibition budgets. Also, the visibility is also there. So, I'm just going to not take long now. I'll just show you some of the fruits without comment. This is the first house. This is my own house. I used to live in this place in the early years. I landed up living here for 10 years while I went out discovering what was happening else. When I realized, actually, I really did have the pressure then to build things differently, because I realized those vernacular ways of living were much more climatically comfortable, etc. So you had to justify if you did a concrete slab in India. This is my current house with a local artisanal 1-inch handmade brick that still continues to be made in that area. Ferro cement in the background there. Some houses in the urban areas, in Pune for example. Or in more remote areas. This one's on your poster, I saw. This is what happened with the stone research. This is the Rammed Earth participatory project I did for a urban eco-community prototype of collective living. A library building. The town hall complex in Auroville. This building is entirely, it's a collective space entirely made of concrete, but using ferrocement loss shuttering. It saves a huge amount of concrete. There were 4 different versions, and we see how many cubic meters of concrete we're going to use and take some engineering decisions to save. So it's not so much about which material we use, it's also about how much can you reduce the consumption. This is what happened with that stone, those granite handcrafted guys. I did a kind of a showroom for handcrafted high-end designer products. So these stone slabs are actually loosely kept in between those other small stone, like cobblestones. They're just like loosely self-supported. In order for, this undulating landscape separates the furniture and other things we're displaying. This is the book, the Library of Lost Books. I was given the theme liberty, and as you know what's going on in Catalonia, I wanted to talk about knowledge setting you free rather than it being a political thing. I think we are all bound in the same earth together. There's no fleeing from each other. We have to live together and find a way, and sometimes, I wanted to direct this kind. I just want to create some humble structure here and extend the public space and the cobble pattern, where rectangular elements create circular structures. I sort of did this because I wanted to make it with the books, unused books of the place. So the library, it's next to the Filmoteca, and it's the same books that are rejected that were used in the place. The toilet that landed up ironically in Zaha Hadid's Roca London Gallery, where the most expensive toilets are displayed, and they called me, they have a gallery there, so they wanted to do an exhibition, so I thought it would be nice to take in the toilet, which was a low-cost thing. But I also like this kind of thing, like to blend that object in just like I do in the landscape. I like to choose somehow, just put in the little color there, and everything else is grey, so it fit with all the Zaha Hadid forms. Similarly, this is what happened with the Chipperfield Biennale, where the brick house really melts into the existing pre-industrial construction system, and the theme was common ground. So I wanted to show that we are more common than we are different, and that it depends how you actually position yourself in continuity or in confrontation with the old and the new. And if you look at the ceiling, it's terracotta with all the wood, and this is same catenary curves, exact serendipitously the same profile as the doorways of the Arsenale, same curve. There's a lot of common ground between this building, which actually is meant for South India, but it actually looks as an extension of the existing building in Venice, rather than some Indian object that was shared over there. So the architecture of the ruin, which reveals the way the building is made, was extended into an incomplete architecture under construction, so it explains how the building is made again. And this is the last Biennale. They gave me the exact same spot by chance, and I had filled into that wooden board, there's a hole there, and I'd already filled in to make it stable the previous year, and it was perfect for me to reuse all of that again. So because it was called, and this is the last thing I'm showing, I just want to end with that statement that, you know, this time it was called Reporting from the Front, and I wanted to say that the battle comes from dualities, and dualities are good actually because they could enrich each other, you know, and I think the problem is when we position dualities to battle against each other rather than bring them together. So the architecture as a coming together of dualities was placed in the middle, the house, and also we've taken one single house and the toilet as a symbol of the problem of affordability of the basic shelter in the world today. So it was positioned in the middle. This is the front line, the axis where you walk, and on one side I put in all the spatial, formal, non-material researches that I have done in architecture on one side, and that's the duality. You know, there are people who are working on the form, there are people who are working on the material, not worrying about the other aspects. So on the other side I had placed all my material research that I've done in all sorts of material groups over the years, and I brought in samples out of all the various projects and the various bricks, the first test brick of this and that, and placed all of those researches along with videos that show the human research of the knowledge building and so on. So this is the last sort of the image of the interior of the house, where you can see actually there are some little holes there where you see you know, the meshes inside it, and yeah, I mean that's what the Germans have in collaboration with us developed to. There are different meshes, these are all made in different ways. So 6 elements were made in Berlin for us to be able to test. All the rest was recycled from the previous Biennale that the Germans put up in for the Art Biennale. So everything was from the place. And the point we're trying to make is that beauty is again an invisible element, aspect of architecture that every human deserves regardless of their budget. It's a very important thing to achieve beauty as well. And that beauty, a bigger budget doesn't automatically ensure a big success, just like in the movies. So with that I end. Thank you.